In 1969, the Nigerian Civil War was halted for 48 hours. The reason? Both warring factions, Nigeria and Biafra, wanted to watch Pele and his club Santos play against Nigeria's national team, the Green Eagles. The match ended in a 2-2 draw, with Pele scoring both goals for Santos. Hi, you're listening to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at the most popular sport in the world, the sport that the Europeans and Latin Americans call football, and the Americans soccer. With about 3.5 to 4 billion fans worldwide, soccer is the number one most popular sport in the world. The earliest form of soccer can be found around the 3rd century BC in China. The game, called Su Chu, was played in China around that time and was part of military training. A ball sewn together from pieces of leather stuffed with feathers and animal hair was kicked into a 30 to 40 centimeter wide net placed 5 meters high. Around 7th century AD, Japan too had a soccer-like game called Kemari, where the goal was to keep the ball in the air for as long as possible. The earliest form of soccer in England can be traced back to the 12th century via a sport called folk ball. It involved punching the ball with your fist and violently tackling the opposing team. Around the 14th century, the sport was banned by King Edward III for its violence and also distracting the soldiers from preparing for war. Modern soccer, as we know it, emerged in 19th century England. In the mid-19th century, the positive qualities of team sports were recognized in England. And as a result, compulsory physical education was introduced in English schools to improve students' fitness. And the introduction of the physical fitness curriculum led to the introduction of 2 sports in English schools. One was association football, where the ball had to be advanced with the feet, and the other was rugby football, where players were allowed to pick the ball and run with it. Now at that time, each school had its own set of rules to play. So when there was a match between 2 schools, the hosting school's rules had to be followed. Finally, in 1848, students at the University of Cambridge got together and wrote the first rules for soccer. Rules which standardized the play across various schools. In 1863, though, the Football Association was formed and the rules were made official. And it is here that the sport came to be known as association football. But British university students loved giving sports slang nicknames. So rugby football was shortened to rugger, and association football was shortened to ASOC or A-soccer, and finally it was transformed into soccer. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, as the Britons spread their wings across the globe, they continued to play soccer in the countries they landed in. And slowly, the locals started picking up the sport, and it became famous in countries like Spain, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Austria, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. As the sport took root worldwide, clubs were formed rapidly. Some of the earliest national soccer associations formed outside the UK included New Zealand in 1891, Argentina in 1893, and Belgium in 1895. As the game continued to gain in popularity, the rules of the game also continued to evolve. In 1866, the offside rule was updated to allow forward passes provided there were at least 3 defending players between the attacker and the goal line. Prior to this update, a player would be offside if they were just ahead of the ball. In 1891, 2 very significant changes were introduced. The first was the penalty kick for fouls inside the 12-yard area. And the second was the implementation of nets over goalposts. This was primarily done to resolve heated disputes that had begun to arise over whether the ball had really crossed the line between the goalposts. The year 1904 was significant because the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, or FIFA, was established. This group provided rules for international matches and soccer associations so that teams from different countries could compete fairly. The association was formed in France, and its other founding members included Belgium, Denmark, Spain, the Netherlands, and Sweden. Wait, but the inventor of the modern game, the United Kingdom, was absent? There was an element of ego at play here. The British nations felt that being the inventors of the game, they were far too advanced to need external oversight. Moreover, 20 years before FIFA was formed, the home nations of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were already competing against each other in the British Home Championship. But within a year, in 1905, the British Football Association officially recognized FIFA and joined the body. And along with that, it carried the legacy of its home championship to FIFA. What I mean is, even today, England, Scotland, and Wales are allowed to compete separately at the FIFA championships. Between 1908 and 1914, FIFA membership expanded beyond Europe. South Africa joined in 1908, Argentina and Chile in 1912, and Canada and the United States in 1913. Meanwhile, before the formation of FIFA, soccer was introduced in the Olympics at the 1900 Paris Games. As a result, it became the first team game to be introduced at the Olympics. At the 1900 and 1904 Games, it was merely an exhibition sport, but it became an official competition at the 1908 London Games. But it took another 88 years to add the women's tournament to the Olympics, and this was done at the 1996 Atlanta Games. In 1914, FIFA formally recognized Olympic soccer as an amateur World Football Championship, and it took over the management of the event. By the 1920s, soccer had transitioned to a professional sport, but the Olympic soccer tournament was still an amateurs-only tournament, and that label prevented the biggest players from competing in the Olympics. So there was a massive push for an alternate tournament where the professionals could compete at a global level. So on May 28, 1928, FIFA's Congress, led by President Jules Rimet, voted to establish an independent, open global championship, the World Cup. The year 1930 was identified as the year the first World Cup would be held, and the nation selected to host it was Uruguay. Why Uruguay? Well, several reasons. One, the country was celebrating its centenary. Second, it had won the previous 2 Olympic gold medals. And 3, it offered to cover travel and accommodation costs for the participating teams. 13 countries participated in the first World Cup. Wait, why 13? When the entire membership of FIFA was 41 at that time. Primarily because of the long cross-ocean travel required during that time. The global economy too was under the Great Depression, so many players were worried that if they traveled outside of their home countries for too long, they may lose their jobs. Due to the long travel that several teams had to endure, the organizers of the event opted for the group format in this event. So there were 4 groups, 3 of them with 3 teams and 1 with 4 teams. The aim was to ensure that every participating team got to play at least 2 matches. The host nation Uruguay won the World Cup, defeating Argentina 4-2 in the finals. And the tournament was not without drama. There was an intense rivalry between Uruguay and Argentina, and that was very reflective of the behavior of the local fans towards the Argentine team. But the drama reached its peak during a group stage match between Argentina and Chile. A vicious foul by Argentine striker Luis Monti in the first half against Chilean Arturo Torres ignited a massive fight between players from both sides in the center of the field. Play had to be suspended, and the police had to intervene to break up the fight. Normalcy was finally restored, and the game continued, with Argentina ultimately beating Chile 3-1 to advance into the semifinals. So now you have the FIFA World Cup for the professionals and the Olympics for the amateurs. And everyone lived happily ever after. Not really. A massive dispute arose between FIFA and the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC, as a run-up to the 1932 Los Angeles Olympics. The IOC had a strict mandate that only amateur athletes could compete in the Olympics. But FIFA was seeing a rapid rise of professional soccer globally and disagreed with these rules. There was no resolution, and the IOC decided to drop soccer altogether from the 1932 Los Angeles Olympics. But soccer returned at the 1936 Berlin Olympics and has stayed on the Olympics roster since then. Coming back to the FIFA World Cup, while the 1930 Uruguay tournament opted for the group stage format, the next two tournaments, Italy 1934 and France 1938, switched to a knockout-only format. That meant these tournaments started with a round of 16, and if you lost a game, you were out of the tournament. However, the penalty shootout was introduced only in 1978. That meant that if a game ended in a draw, even after extra time, the two teams met again for a rematch the following day. There was one major update to rules regarding goalkeeping in 1912. Prior to 1912, goalkeepers were allowed to handle the ball anywhere in their own half. However, in 1912, the rules were updated to limit handling strictly in the penalty area, which means if a goalkeeper ventures outside of the penalty area, they can only use their foot to trap the ball, not their hands. The World Cup 1934, which was hosted by Italy, is often regarded as the most controversial in history. Italy was being ruled by Benito Mussolini, and there was significant evidence of political manipulation and referee intimidation to ensure that Italy won that tournament. Mussolini reportedly met with match officials and had dinner with Swedish referee Ivan Eklund before Italy's semi-final and final matches. The outcome was several disputed calls by the referee in Italy's favor. Allegations also existed that the Italian Football Association bribed the Greek Football Federation to withdraw from a qualifying match by gifting them a house in Athens to use as headquarters. Italy won the tournament, beating Czechoslovakia 2-1 in the finals. The previous winner, Uruguay, boycotted this tournament in protest against Europe's lack of participation in the 1930 Uruguay tournament. If the 1934 tournament was controversial, the 1938 tournament in France was full of stress and tension. Europe was in the firm grip of fascism and Nazism, and the prospect of war was hovering all over the horizon. Spain, which was affected by a civil war, was absent, and Austria, which had recently been annexed by Nazi Germany, was removed from the roster. Argentina and Uruguay withdrew from the tournament in protest against the tournament being held in Europe back-to-back. Their expectation was that the tournament would switch between Europe and South America. The political climate was visible on the field as well, as the Italian and German teams faced an upset audience through the course of the tournament. The Italian players made fascist salutes before the games, and refused to play in any color other than black, which was the fascist color. It was in this tournament that Brazil first caught the fancy of the audience with their creative and rhythmic play. Brazil went on to win the third spot in the tournament, beating Sweden 4-2. Another milestone achieved in this tournament was the participation of the first Asian team in World Cup soccer, which was the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. Italy won the tournament once again, defeating Hungary 4-2 in the finals. Wait, so we were saying Italy won the 1934 tournament due to a lot of back-channel manipulation by Benito Mussolini. But winning the tournament back-to-back would mean that there was an element of talent in the team as well. That is true, and there was one major factor at play here. It was the Oriundi system. Since the 1930s, in preparation for the 1934 World Cup, Italy actively scouted and recruited elite South American stars of Italian descent. They were known as Oriundi. A lot of the world-class players in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay had Italian ancestry, and Mussolini ensured that they were granted fast-track citizenship to play both in the Italian domestic league as well as the Italian national team. As a result, notable players like Raimondo Orsi and Luis Monti, who played for Argentina in the 1930 World Cup, were poached by Italy and ended up playing for Italy in the 1934 tournament. But why South America? What was so special about South American soccer players? It was essentially a very creative style of soccer that the South American players displayed, primarily because of the setup in which they played. The South Americans essentially learned the game on the streets, beaches, or improvised dirt pitches, where they played in tight, chaotic spaces, which forced them to develop supreme improvisation and quick reflexes. With no coaches around to discipline them, they relied on tricks and very unique skills to beat opponents. And this creativity included the samba dance style of soccer, which was displayed by the Brazilians. The South Americans displayed extreme success in breaking past the highly organized European defense using sheer individual brilliance. And the foundation for very strong South American teams was laid by the Copa America Championship, which started in 1916, way ahead of the World Cup soccer tournament. It created a hyper-competitive environment, which boosted the standard of play across South American nations, especially across Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil, who dominated the tournament during its early years. After the 1938 World Cup, Adolf Hitler petitioned FIFA for Germany to host the 1942 tournament. But that tournament had to be cancelled because of World War II. The 1946 edition too had to be cancelled because the world had not yet recovered from World War II. 1950 ended up being the first time after World War II that the FIFA World Cup tournament was held. The host nation? Brazil. The European nations were still recovering from World War II, so South America was a natural choice to host the tournament. In preparation for the tournament, Brazil constructed the famous Maracanã Stadium, which could host up to 200,000 spectators and was the biggest in the world at that time. Interestingly, construction on the stadium was still happening during the tournament. The World Cup trophy was now named the Jules Rimet Trophy after FIFA President Jules Rimet, who initiated the first World Cup in 1930. The group stage was re-established in the 1950 tournament, but this tournament was the only World Cup not to include a specific final. The winners from each group made it to the last four stage and then played round robin amongst each other to determine the winner. Germany and Japan were banned from participation for obvious reasons. India qualified for the first and the only time, but was unable to participate due to financial and logistical reasons. The Soviets refused to participate, primarily because Stalin did not want to lose to a Western European nation on the field. Transatlantic flights had now started, so quite a few European nations participated. Italy, though, chose to get to Brazil via the sea route because of the Superga air disaster of May 1949, when Italy lost its Torino FC soccer team in that air crash. So Italy did not want to take any chances with air travel. The 1950 World Cup was also the first World Cup tournament where players had numbers on their backs for easier identification. The hosts, Brazil, having recently won the Copa America tournament, were the hot favorites to win this World Cup. Uruguay, Brazil, Sweden, and Spain were the four group winners that advanced to the round-robin final stage. On July 16, 1950, the last match of the final round-robin group stage was to be played between Brazil and Uruguay. Brazil just needed a draw to win the tournament. Uruguay needed a win. Several local newspapers, including the mayor of Rio de Janeiro, had granted the win to Brazil. In fact, the Rio de Janeiro mayor had already prepared the speech he would deliver after Brazil's victory. The 200,000 capacity Maracanã Stadium was jam-packed. The first half was exciting but goalless. But just 2 minutes into the second half, Brazil scored and the crowd went into a frenzy. Brazil won, Uruguay 0. The Uruguayan captain Varela rallied his team, and in the 66th minute, Uruguay scored the equalizer. Brazil won, Uruguay won. There was no concern still because a draw would still hand the trophy over to Brazil. And everything looked under control until the 79th minute when Uruguayan Alcides Guixa scored the winning goal. Brazil won, Uruguay 2. The Maracanã Stadium went into a pin-drop silence. Uruguay lifted the cup, and this Brazilian defeat is often referred to as the Maracanazo, or the Maracanã blow. Only a few years before he passed away, Alcides Guixa, who scored the match winner in this match, delivered a famous quote in an interview with FIFA. Reminiscing his World Cup winning goal, he famously stated, "Only 3 people have ever been able to silence the Maracanã: the Pope, Frank Sinatra, and me." And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which border checkpoint in East Berlin witnessed the most crossings on the night of the collapse of the Berlin Wall? The Bornholmer Strasse in North Berlin witnessed the largest immediate surge, which was estimated at about 20,000 people within an hour alone. So the answer is D, Bornholmer Strasse. Question for the current episode. Including the 2026 World Cup soccer tournament, which is the first and the only country so far to host the competition thrice. Is it A, the USA, B, France, C, Germany, including West Germany, or D, Mexico? Once again, including the 2026 World Cup soccer tournament, which is the only country so far to have hosted the tournament thrice? Is it A, the USA, B, France, C, Germany, including West Germany, or D, Mexico? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll tune in again in 2 weeks when we continue our exploration of world soccer history beyond 1950. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.